For decades, the world has tried almost everything to resolve the Middle East conflict. War, ceasefires, sanctions, retaliation, peace talks, diplomatic summits, foreign interventions, military occupations, international pressure, more war. And yet, the conflict persists. Generation after generation, the region remains trapped in a cycle that appears almost immune to resolution. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this. The more modern civilization attempts to solve the problem through power, the more unstable the system becomes. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if the conflict is not merely political? What if it is structural? What if we are witnessing not simply a territorial dispute, but a deeper collision between power, memory, legitimacy, identity, and humanity's ancient obsession with domination? Because beneath the headlines, beneath the propaganda, beneath the endless arguments about who started what and who deserves what, there may exist a hidden pattern. A pattern that does not apply only to the Middle East, but to civilization itself. One of the greatest obstacles to understanding the Middle East conflict is that modern discourse rewards simplification. Everything must fit into good versus evil, oppressor versus oppressed, civilization versus barbarism, security versus resistance. And while elements of truth may exist within each narrative, none of them fully explain why this conflict has defied every proposed solution for generations. If the issue were purely military, superior force would have settled it long ago. If it were purely diplomatic, negotiations would have resolved it by now. If the conflict were purely economic, enough money has already been poured into the region to build several mini-planets. And yet here we are, still circling the same fire. Because the conflict is unfolding far beneath the level where modern systems prefer to diagnose problems. Modern systems are extremely good at measuring visible things. Military strength, GDP, borders, treaties, weapons, resources. But human beings are not governed by visible realities alone. People also live through memory, identity, belonging, humiliation, historical consciousness, inherited fear, sacred meaning. And when these invisible forces are ignored, societies become unstable no matter how sophisticated their institutions appear. Civilization often behaves like a man trying to repair a collapsing house by repainting the walls while ignoring the cracked foundation beneath it. It looks productive. It feels intelligent. But the structure beneath the paint continues to fracture and disintegrate. To understand this more deeply, we need to examine something broader than the Middle East itself. We need to examine the logic of civilization. Throughout nature, systems tend toward equilibrium. Not perfection. Not utopia. But equilibrium. Forests stabilize themselves. Ecosystems balance themselves. Life continuously adapts through complex relationships of coexistence and limitation. Nature is not sentimental. But it is remarkably resistant, even hostile, to prolonged imbalance. Human civilization, however, often behaves differently. Rather than adapting ourselves to reality, we repeatedly attempt to bend reality around our ambitions and vanity. And this is where a dangerous pattern emerges. A pattern we might call artificial selection. Natural selection is governed primarily by survival and adaptation. In contrast, artificial selection in human civilization often becomes the survival of the mightiest. And history reveals to us something deeply uncomfortable. The mightiest are not always the wisest. In fact, human history contains an alarming number of powerful people who possessed the emotional maturity of exhausted toddlers, with advanced weapon systems. This, evidently, is not the ideal combination for planetary stability. Power, when detached from wisdom, naturally drifts toward domination. And domination creates imbalance. This imbalance has shaped much of human history, as is clearly reflected in slavery, colonization, imperial expansion, ethnic displacement, resource exploitation, civilizational humiliation, etc. The modern world likes to imagine these things as disconnected historical episodes. But perhaps they are manifestations of the same underlying pattern. The belief that some groups possess greater entitlement to land, dignity, legitimacy, or existence than others. And once that mindset becomes normalized, conflict becomes inevitable. This is because no civilization remains psychologically stable while large populations feel historically erased, uprooted, or denied legitimacy. Nowhere is this tension more visible than in the Middle East. Here, a problem immediately emerges. Modern discourse pressures everyone to choose a side before they are even allowed to think. The moment nuance enters the conversation, suspicion follows shortly behind. But serious analysis requires something increasingly rare in the modern age: the willingness to observe complexity without immediately collapsing into tribal reflexes. The Middle East conflict is often discussed as though it began yesterday. But this conflict is wrapped in layers upon layers of history. Empire, migration, conquest, religion, trauma, memory, colonial intervention, and competing narratives of legitimacy. This is not just a dispute over territory. It is a struggle over historical continuity itself. Who belongs? Who remembers? Whose suffering counts? Whose history is recognized? Whose legitimacy is affirmed? And perhaps most importantly, can two deeply rooted historical identities coexist without one attempting to erase the other? Today's geopolitics tends to approach these questions mechanically. Draw borders. Sign agreements. Deploy forces. Negotiate settlements. Manage security. And so on. But human beings are not machines. You cannot simply rearrange populations, redraw maps, impose systems, and expect historical consciousness to quietly evaporate because diplomats sign documents in expensive hotels. History does not vanish because modern institutions become impatient with it. In many ways, history behaves more like buried fire. Ignored long enough, it erupts through the surface again. And this is where modern civilization repeatedly misunderstands the nature of conflict. Because modern systems are designed primarily to manage power. But unresolved historical consciousness cannot be permanently subdued through power alone. Force can suppress instability temporarily. But suppression and resolution are not the same thing. The deeper tragedy is that the Middle East may not actually be an exception. It might be more of a mirror. A mirror reflecting a broader civilizational misalignment. Throughout history, human systems repeatedly drift toward what might be called Babel logic, which is manifested in centralized domination, excessive control, civilizational arrogance, as well as engineered order imposed from above. The assumption is always the same. If enough power is applied, human complexity can eventually be forced into stability. But reality rarely cooperates for long. This is because human beings are not merely economic units or geopolitical variables. People need dignity, continuity, meaning, rootedness, and belonging. And systems that ignore these realities eventually produce instability, regardless of military sophistication. Modern civilization often mistakes technological advancement for psychological maturity. But the two are not necessarily related. A society may develop artificial intelligence while remaining emotionally incapable of coexistence. This is the real tension beneath the surface of progress. The Middle East conflict exposes this contradiction brutally. If you recognize these patterns in modern life, subscribe to the Inner Republic. Like and share this video with someone who feels overwhelmed by the noise, but cannot yet explain why. Remember, clarity begins the moment fragmentation is noticed. The world possesses satellites, cyber warfare, precision missiles, surveillance systems, advanced diplomacy, nuclear deterrence, artificial intelligence. And yet humanity still struggles to answer one ancient question. How do human beings share space, memory, and dignity without attempting to dominate one another? That is not merely a Middle Eastern question. It is a human question. Take a moment and ask yourself, is modern life making us more conscious, or more fragmented? Leave a comment. Your perspective shapes this exploration. Together, we reclaim clarity from the noise. Part of what makes this conflict emotionally exhausting to observe is that people intuitively sense that something deeper is broken, even when they cannot articulate it. The cycle repeats so often that it begins to feel almost structural. Violence, retaliation, outrage, mourning, negotiation, collapse, repetition. And every side accumulates memory. Memory of loss. Memory of fear. Memory of humiliation. Memory of injustice. Over time, entire populations inherit emotional realities they did not personally create but, nevertheless, carry. And once collective identity fuses with unresolved historical pain, conflict becomes extraordinarily difficult to untangle. Because people are no longer fighting merely over land. They are fighting over narrative, legitimacy, continuity, and existential recognition. This is why purely military solutions repeatedly fail. And it is also why diplomatic solutions often collapse shortly after celebration ceremonies and carefully worded press conferences. The deeper psychological architecture remains unresolved. Modern civilization keeps attempting to solve human fragmentation externally while leaving the internal dimensions untouched. But history has often shown that civilizations fracture internally long before they collapse from external forces. Perhaps this is the uncomfortable truth hiding beneath the Middle East conflict. The crisis is not just about territory. It is about humanity's recurring inability to balance power with wisdom, identity with coexistence, history with humility. And as long as domination remains more attractive to civilizations than mutual legitimacy, instability will continue to regenerate across generations. Not only in the Middle East, but across the human story itself. Because systems built primarily around power eventually begin consuming the very stability they were designed to protect. And perhaps that is why peace has remained so elusive. Not because humanity lacks intelligence, but because intelligence without deeper alignment often becomes sophisticated chaos. In the next video, we will go deeper into one of the most important questions surrounding the chronic conflict in the Middle East. Why do peace efforts repeatedly fail? Why do negotiations collapse generation after generation despite enormous international involvement and goodwill? And why do war and diplomacy somehow keep producing the same outcome? This is because the answer may lie not in politics alone, but in memory, identity, and the psychology of unresolved civilizations. If these ideas resonate with you, subscribe and become part of the Inner Republic, where clarity is cultivated in the midst of noise. Future videos will explore attention, civilization, psychology, power, identity, and the hidden architecture of modern life. Until next time, protect your attention.